Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. Erik Skopil's on the show. I'm Matt Prehm. Another basketball-focused show today because it's March. Postseason has arrived for the women. The men will start their postseason run next week, and it's a perfect time to lose your voice. So that's where we're at right now, Erik. But nonetheless, the women, they have left for Indy. The Big Ten tournament starts actually today as of this recording, but the women will play tomorrow. They get a first round bye. Let's go back, though, to last Sunday. They played their final regular season game of the year at Washington, a 64-56 loss. I think a road loss it's not acceptable, but it's understandable, maybe. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong there in that regard. But the bigger story for me is the news that you wrote about before the tip is Oregon's without one of their best defenders now.
Yeah, I think one of their better overall players, Elisa Mevius. She suffered a hand injury on that Michigan road trip back in like kind of mid to early February, like the first weekend of February, around there.
January 30th at Michigan State, February 2nd at Michigan.
Right. So it was that Michigan game, like right at the start of February. She suffers a hand injury. She comes back. There was concern she'd play their next game against Maryland. And that I was talking to people, they said, it's just a bruise. There's no structural damage. We don't think this is something serious. And I don't know if they did more testing later on or if something changed, but she was able to play the subsequent 5 games. And then on Sunday morning announced on social media, she had broken bones in that hand, that they had to do surgery or season being shut down. This was on her shooting hand. And in that stretch, by the way, Matt, she hit 4 threes and had 19 points in a game. She'd had a couple of her better offensive games. I think she had 14 points in another game, 11 in it, and then another one after that. So like this great stretch of offensive productivity, despite the fact that she has a hand injury. And this one hurts. I mean, I think you even saw it on Sunday against Washington. This is your best perimeter defensive player. This is your most impactful pilfer of the basketball. She's somebody who, was second nationally last year. She had like 4.5 steals per game. This year, that number went down significantly, but still led the team with almost 2 per game. Kind of the head of the defensive monster for a team that prides itself on being a really good defensive team. And I actually think they played pretty okay to pretty well defensively against Washington, considering that's a really strong offensive team, holding them to 64. I think that's the lowest number they've had for 6 to 8 weeks, or 6 to 8 games, I should say. But you still can't help but say, gosh, down the stretch against Washington, there were some moments where maybe there's a little bit different of defensive intensity we're throwing the court. So that one, I agree, Matt, that hurts. It throws a wrench a little bit into what they're doing. Fortunately, they have the depth from a player perspective to at least, I guess, kind of bounce back from it. But gosh, in terms of just how impactful it is, it really is one of the few players you'd hate to lose. And I think going into postseason play now with the Big Ten tournament tomorrow at 9 a.m. against Indiana, it's hard not to think they're playing at kind of less than 100%. And what does that do for them down the stretch here, where this is a team that was winning by the slimmest of margins? It's going to be difficult maybe to see this team winning the types of games they need to make a deep run into March. So yeah, you're right, Matt. This one hurts. And then just the Washington loss, just kind of quickly on that, I think they went 4-5 on the road in Big Ten play, which is, I think, pretty darn admirable considering 8 of those 9 games are all the way across the country. To go 4-4 against traditional Big Ten road teams was, I think, one of the more impressive parts about what this team was able to do this year. Picking up some solid wins too over Michigan State, Minnesota. Those are going to be NCAA tournament teams. Not being able to get that Washington one didn't necessarily surprise me, but it did take away, I guess, a level of certainty that they are for sure in the dance going into this week. I think if they'd won that game, we'd be sitting here going, they're in. Now it's just a matter of what their seed looks like. I still think they have a really good chance of making this tournament, but if they lose to Indiana tomorrow, crazy stuff happens in other conference tournaments. They open themselves up to being one of those teams left out.
Now we're in Indy, and they play Indiana on Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific time tip-off. That's going to be incredibly early. Big Ten Network.
No kidding.
Thankfully, they got there last night. It looked like Tuesday, maybe even Monday.
I think they flew out Monday evening. I think.
Okay, so they've been there a little bit. They've been able to acclimate themselves to the time zone change and what have you. But still, nonetheless, a 9 a.m. tip on a Thursday morning is going to be strange. Indiana, they played one time. They won that game 54-47. It was played in Eugene in middle of January or January 24th. Peyton Scott had 14 points, and I think that was the game or one of the games. Etute, one of the freshman forwards, had a big performance for the Ducks. Just what's your thoughts on this matchup? What do we need to know? Sydney Parrish is still on this team, isn't she?
Yeah, she is. Still a starter, still Indiana's best 3-point shooter. Production-wise, pretty much is tapped out at like a 11 to 12 point per play game player. Not that that's a bad player, but she was, I think, the 6th ranked player in the country in her recruiting class, and you thought she'd maybe be someone who'd be a little bit more productive. But Indiana's a tough matchup just because they can really shoot the basketball. Maybe one of the 4 or 5 best shooting teams in this conference. We know if you've watched Oregon this year, they're not that team. They are statistically the worst 3-point shooting team in the Big Ten. I think the first game was a game that Oregon played really, really well in the fourth quarter to pull away. I think they were trailing, or it was just a game that was like kind of back and forth the whole way, and then Oregon had a nice run late to separate. This is going to be tough. I mean, you mentioned it, Matt. It's 9 a.m., which is weird on the body clock. It's also in Indiana, which is where this. I know it's not in Bloomington, but Bloomington is a little closer to Indianapolis than Eugene. Last I checked. You just kind of there's some things kind of, I don't want to say working against Oregon, but this is not going to be easy by any means. And I think you go back and think about that first game, they did a really good job on a couple of the Indiana star players. Yarden Garzone is their leading scorer. She was held to 8 points on 4 of 14 shooting. They held a couple of other players well below their averages as well. Like, that was a game where the defense really stepped up. You hold a team to 47 points. That's pretty evident. Can they do that again without Mevius? Is a pretty baseline question. And the other thing that I think really kind of stood out coming from his last one is, can they get more out of Filipina Che? She goes for 20 and 25 on senior day about 10 days ago against Rutgers. And then against Washington, 4 points, 3 rebounds, I think. And Kelly Graves, did not hold back in the post-game radio. Was like, this is baloney. She wasn't ready to play. We've got to be focused. You can't go out and do 20 and 25 and the next game go for, what she had. So right. They need to get more out of her. Clearly, she's a size mismatch. Indiana is not a big team, but the first time she didn't have a very impactful game either. She only scored 4 points. So in 13 minutes, can they get her going? I feel like that becomes a pretty big, part of the story going into this game, because she will have the size advantage, and that just becomes a matter of, can Indiana use that to their advantage with the foot speed and quickness and stretch her out and everything, considering that they can shoot the ball pretty well 1 through 5.
I'm assuming the expectation should be they win this game, right? Like, even without Mevius, they have a size advantage in Filipina Che. DJ Kelly's a terrific scorer.
She's been playing really well. Yep.
They've got other pieces in place here where they can play well and they can score, and they should walk away with a win, at least from my perspective. But what's the kind of the goal? What's the ceiling of the tournament run for the women here in Indy? Like, how can they help them? Because they're in that weird spot where they're like in the tournament projection, but a bad game could maybe make them be on the bubble. But what's their ceiling? Can they really improve much of their seed line, or are they just playing to just 100% secure an at-large bid no matter what?
Yeah, that last part's kind of where my head's at. I'm thinking, go out there. If you beat Indiana, you're in for sure. There's no debate. I think if you lose to Indiana, if you look at the bracketology, it's kind of interesting because, and this came out a couple of days ago, so they're missing some results. But ESPN's most recent bracketology has Oregon and Indiana as team 8 and team 7 from the cut line on the good side. So, 8 teams or 7 teams are are below Oregon in the cut line, 6 teams for Indiana. So these teams are like kind of right next to each other, very similar resumes, kind of in a similar spot right now. And I think for both teams, it's like you win, you know you're in. You lose, you still feel really solid about where you're at. But it's not a bad loss for either of them, clearly. But if you do lose and craziness happens in other conference tournaments, and like let's say Washington, who's I think kind of on the bubble, if they get hot and they make a run, and somebody like I said, like I'm looking at these last 4 out. Like Virginia Tech is one of the teams out. Arizona is a team out in the Big 12. Like, do one of those teams make a run that's unexpected and then they kind of knock you out? Like, you open yourself up to that. So I think that's the first part. Is if you beat Indiana, you're in. If you lose, you think you're going to hear your name called on Sunday, but you're not 100%. And then in terms of like what more can they achieve, Matt? I mean, the reality is they play USC with a win on Friday at 9 a.m. And USC is playing about as well as anybody in the country this year. They swept UCLA, which I don't think a lot of people expected would happen. Really impressive. Yeah. I mean, just how Juju's played in these big games. I voted for her for Big Ten Player of the Year. I thought she was very deserving of that. That's a really tough game. They played them solid in December. I think it was like 65-53 if memory serves, something like that. If you could theoretically win that game, then suddenly, oh my gosh, you maybe move up a couple of seed lines. That would be one of the bigger wins of the year for anybody that's on the bubble. But that's pretty unlikely, I think, to be clear. And so unless that happens, this is basically just playing to secure yourself in the tournament. And I guess if you're thinking even more specifically, like to avoid being in those first 4 games, just a few days before the real tournament starts, the regular part of it starts, is I guess the other part you're looking at. You want to be avoid playing that extra game if possible. So I think that's kind of what's at stake for Thursday morning in Indy.
When we look at the women's side, is there, who's a wild card? Like, is it Palatea and her shooting? Is it I don't know, Peyton Scott having a good 3-point percentage game? Is it Filipina Che? Who's the wild card for Oregon, where if they can get consistent play from this person, Oregon's going to be in a much better position. Like on the men's side, like Dan Altman came out and said it last night, like that's Kwami Evans.
Yep.
Like who is the Kwami Evans of the women's team right now?
I probably would say Filipina Che, just based upon the fact that, I mean, Kelly, I was really taken aback listening to postgame radio. I don't disagree with the tactic. This is somebody, obviously, he has worked with for 4 years and knows her hopefully well enough to know what buttons to push. But he didn't hold back in that postgame after the Washington game. He was really frustrated with what she provided. And, you hope that she receives that in the right way and then comes out and plays, motivated and energized, because she really is a difference maker for this team. I mean, you go look at when she scores in double digits, it's very infrequent. I haven't actually done this, but let's go pull it up here. When she scores in double digits, I don't feel like they lose very often. And I think getting her the ball early, getting her post touches is something that they need to establish, but also understanding, and this is the counter and the part that was frustrating.
They're 9-2 when she scores in double figures.
There you go. So that's pretty damn impressive. The 2 losses, one of which I'm just looking at here, was Nebraska, where she went 16-9. And that was in overtime. That was the game where Nebraska hit 8 threes in the fourth quarter in overtime. All 8 shots they shot from 3 they made, to just absolutely break Oregon's heart. And if they win that game, by the way, we're not having this conversation about them being on the bubble. They would be securely in. But the thing that's tough with her is, I think they tried to get her involved in Seattle, and she went 1 for 5. And again, if you watch her play, these are point blank shots. And this is, if she can finish like she did against Rutgers, and I know that was, for several reasons, kind of an outlier game, but she was 10 of 15 in that game. And again, easy shots. She's 6'8". She's right at the rim. These are shots she should be able to make, but the game against Nebraska, she was 7 for 8. And so it's such an up and down, even just in terms of how she's finishing, regardless of, the team's ability to get her entry passes and get her set up. So I think she's pivotal. And then just the one other name I'd throw out there, Matt, would be Katie Fiso, the freshman, who's kind of starting to figure it out. She's had some really nice minutes these last couple of weeks. With Mevius now out, somebody needs to kind of step up and fill in some of that playmaking. She's nowhere near the defensive player, but she's probably a little bit more skilled in terms of creating her shot and setting up teammates. So pretty comparable in terms of that, I guess. Mevius is a good passer and playmaker. I think that's another name just to kind of keep an eye on. I'm not sure if she's going to play 20 minutes per night, but certainly somebody like they're going to need to rely on now that one of their premier perimeter players is out.
Oregon will play Indiana tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific time. You can read Erik's coverage on the women's team and their run through the month of March at duckterritory.com. Erik, let's move to the men now. They close out senior day with a very gritty, physical 73-64 win over an Indiana team that had won 3 in a row, was back on the right side of the bubble, and knew that if they beat Oregon, they probably punched their ticket to the NCAA tournament. And it felt like an NCAA tournament game. It felt like a conference tournament game where two teams, they're fighting for their season's lives. And for most of the game, Oregon was in control, but it was a game in which Oregon never really had like a big lead. It was always a 2-possession, maybe a 3-possession game for the most part. And then, the biggest run they had was the last 90 seconds when they went on a 10-0 run. And the biggest lead that they had was at the end of the game when they won by 9. A game in which Oregon's half-court offense was not good. And I think a lot of that goes to the credit of Indiana. I think some of that is mismatch problems. They were, TJ Bamba was being guarded by a much bigger and athletic guy, which prevented him from getting downhill and kind of creating those layup opportunities or foul attempts, just because Mackenzie Mbako is just bigger and was as athletic as Bamba was. But once again, Nate Biddle showed up big. Jackson Shelson hit the 30-footer. They got to the free throw line. And I think the biggest takeaway, though, is this team's kind of figured out that they can be pretty good if they lock in on defense first. And they can grind wins out. And this was those – Dan Allman always talks about in the NCAA tournament, you're going to have a game where you just play unbelievably good offensively and defensively. You're going to, if you make a run. And then you're going to have another game where you kind of play about to your averages. And then you have another one where it's a slugfest. It's a rock fight. It's ugly basketball because you're just not playing well. And Oregon's had a lot of those games this year where they've won. And this was the latest one. And I walked away thinking, like, this team's got some serious potential. And they've started to buy in defensively. Nate Biddle anchoring the interior and TJ Bamba at the perimeter. You've seen a couple of Bamba's games now, some of the men's games now. You were there out in person. I think Bamba's up there in terms of on-ball defense that we've seen under Dana Altman in a long time. And I'm not going to say he's the best ever, but he's in the discussion.
Yeah, and he was critical late in this last game. I'm trying to think of the order because I was there in the crowd, so I wasn't tracking it quite as close as you would have been, Matt. But that steal he had felt like it was kind of put the game away, and then I'm pretty sure followed. Indiana hit a 3 like the next possession after Oregon had an empty possession, but he was really pivotal in that game. And a lot of players were. I mean, I think that was one of the things that stood out was just how many players contributed to this and how many different players are capable of contributing and getting them on the winning side. And just like it feels like they're doing what Dana Altman teams do this time of year. 6 straight wins now, Matt. I mean, They lost 5 in a row. Now they've won 6 in a row. I mean, I just feel like that's kind of what this season has been like. And this run, we talked about it before, not the toughest stretch of schedule at all. Probably one of the easier parts, but at the same time, like the issue they had earlier in the year was losing to teams that they shouldn't lose to, right? I mean, you don't expect them to lose
to Nebraska and you shouldn't lose at Minnesota.
I was just going to say, those were the 2 that were just kind of like head scratchers of like, really, you're going to lose? If you're trying to be a real NCAA tournament team that's going to make a run, like you can't lose to these teams that aren't teams that are going to be in the field. So even the Northwestern game, which was the start of this run, which I know they ended up winning, was kind of an ugly, just so there's been up and down play. And so to see them win these 6 straight, Matt, I think has been really impressive. And you have to be encouraged about kind of where they're headed. And I will say it was very classic Dana afterwards you mentioned the Jackson shot. I mean, that was a 30-footer shot clock running down, basically wins them the game, puts them up. And afterwards, it's just classic Dana of him being like, "Fortunate shot, lucky we hit it, good," and then took credit and said, "He hit some really tough shots and all that." But I just thought that was very Dana of like, you could tell he is, even in this run, frustrated with some of the things that are happening with this team, but clearly pretty encouraged about a lot of the developments. And I thought the Kwame stuff in particular stood out to me of how much he's clearly pushing this guy to take the step, and how much that's mattered the last 4 or 5 games here.
Yeah, 6 wins in a row. And Kwame Evans, you look at his game log, and Dana said it goes back to the Michigan State game, in which they lost, granted. But he had 10 points, he had 7 rebounds, he had a block shot. He was highly efficient in 16 minutes. Against Northwestern, he really didn't do much. He had 1 point, 2 rebounds, and a block shot. But following that, 8 points, 4 rebounds, 8 points, 3 rebounds, 2 blocks, 10 points, 9 rebounds, a block, 8 points, 6 rebounds, 2 blocks, 10 points, 6 rebounds, 2 steals, 2 assists, most recently against Indiana.
Yeah.
His last 6-7 games have been honestly what NBA scouts were envisioning at the beginning of the year, what Oregon was envisioning at the beginning of the year. And he doesn't necessarily need to be a 15 points per game scorer. Oregon doesn't need that. They've got guys that can give you that. What they need is the intangibles that he brings to the floor with the 6'10" body and extremely long arms, super athletic, where he grabs rebounds now that you're like, wow, that wasn't impressive. I didn't think he was going to grab that. Or he blocks shots that you didn't anticipate him blocking. He gets deflections on entry passes. He takes Oregon to another level. I think Brandon Angel's probably the overall better player, but if you were looking at the ceiling and the floor, Angel's ceiling is probably just a bit above what Kwame Evans's floor is at. Evans can go to a whole nother gear here, and we're starting to see that now. He hit 2 threes against Indiana. One of them was a really big one in the first half. He's efficient from the field, and he's the X factor. And if Oregon can continue to get him to play like this level, it's going to be hard to beat Oregon, because Nate Biddle is turning himself into one of the best big men in college basketball. You've got a dynamic point guard. You've got a really good shooter in Keyshawn Bartholomew. Bamba is a lockdown defender. And then you throw in the Evans factor here, and it takes them to another level where you really can't double anybody. And you yourself can take defensive risks, because now you kind of have 3 defensive enforcers on the floor at one time with Biddle, Bamba, and now potentially Evans.
And Mookie Cook for 9 seconds every game to force a turnover and then go back to the bench, which was I like that. Again, everybody has a role, and they're starting to figure them out. And I think, just kind of taking a step back here, Matt, the Nate Biddle part of this, somebody posted this on the board earlier in the week of like, where does he stack up in the school's all-time center list? And somebody was asking if he's the best ever. And I think if you look through the stats and kind of the history of Oregon,
he's not there yet.
He's not there. Blair Rasmussen. But, and this was kind of what I wanted to get to, is I think he's got a great case to be Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. I'll be curious to see that voting. I know he leads the conference in shot blocks, and he's the last 2 games, I think he has 9, just getting better there. But I'm wondering, Matt, like and there's still some, we should note, like, he took part in senior day yesterday, but he has another year left. And you had the story, I think late last week over the weekend, about he's still kind of making some decisions on what he wants to do with that year. He could come back, he might not. To the question of like, where does he stack up in the school's all-time center list? I think right now he's outside the Mount Rushmore. Probably you'd have like Stan Love, Blair Rasmussen, Jordan Bell, maybe Chris Boucher, something like that. Maybe I'm forgetting an obvious name, and you can correct me, Matt. But like, you'd have those sorts of names. Genuine and Folly, Dante, I should throw him out as well. If Nate were to come back and have another standout season on par, if not better, from this, you'd really start to discuss him in a different light with those guys. And that, I think, speaks to the player he's become this year. So kind of an open-ended topic there for you, Matt. But I just think Biddle's been so impactful, and the possibility of having him obviously for this tournament run after you didn't have him a year ago, but then maybe even for next year.
Yeah, so Biddle applied for a medical hardship last season, only playing in 5 games. Dane Altman said he has that hardship approved. So he has a year available to him next season if he wants to use it. Bill hasn't spoken in a couple weeks, so we haven't had a chance to talk to him about that. I imagine Chris Hansen of the Registered Guard, he's the only media member that's traveling to Indiana for the Big Ten tournament. I imagine he will be the first one to get Biddle unless he speaks up in Seattle. And Hansen will probably ask him about it. We'll find out then what happens. But to answer your question, like, injuries and illness, I think, have slowed his progress. And I would be much more open to this idea if we'd had a healthy Biddle all of last season. And you factor in where he's at this year. His 67 blocks this season are 7th all-time in a single season record for an Oregon Duck big man, or I guess just any player. You look at his blocks of 122 overall in his career, and that's 5th ahead of Blair Asmussen, Tony Woods, Chris Christopherson, Henry
Fred Jones on that list,
yes,
which was pretty cool. I was surprised to see him there.
But I think to answer the question of center, like, Jordan Bell's a hard one because from a physical standpoint, like, he was only 6'7", and it's not really a true center. But that's what he played. He played center at Oregon, and
right.
So I would argue probably Jordan Bell is probably the best center, and all defensive player multiple years. I think he won defensive player of the year in the Pac-12 one year. Holds the school record for block shots with 235. You look at rebounding. He isn't in the most. He's not in the most rebounds for a career, but he has a year in which he's 7th all time for most rebounds in a season. Because remember, he only played 3 years. He didn't play 4. Marty Lunin is probably the best power forward at Oregon. And Folly Dante is probably up there. Chris Boucher is probably up there as well. If it's not going to be Jordan Bell, it's probably going to be Chris Boucher, but he's only here 2 years. But if Biddle does come back, and if Biddle does expand on his game, and you see slight improvements from where he's at this season, he is 100% going to be the end of the discussion. He has turned himself, I think, into an NBA guy, and kudos to him for not saying he's coming back yet, even if he is, because you've got all the leverage right now. If you're Nate Biddle, like, the NBA is going to be intrigued with Nate Biddle. Say Oregon wins 2 games in Indy, and he has a big performance in both of those games, and then they lose in the semifinals, and he has a big game there. They get to the tournament. They make a Sweet 16 run. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibilities for Oregon right now. And he has a huge imprint on all 3 of those games that they play. Who's to say that an NBA team's not going to come in and say, hey, you're 21 years old. You're still kind of in line with the age range of your year. You're a 7-footer, which is rare. You can defend the pick and roll. You can defend the paint. You can shoot 3-pointers. We're interested. We might pull a trigger on OKC using one of their 50,000 first-round draft picks that they have at the end of the first round. And that's a real possibility. I mean, if Biddle has a huge climb up through the month of March, look at Dante's stock and where it went when he was so good in Vegas and was so good in just 2 games in the NCAA tournament. He went from undrafted to being drafted, or to signing a 2-way deal. Biddle's holding all the leverage right now, and even if he does intend to come back, don't announce it now to maximize your earning potential NIL wise from Oregon. Get as much money as you possibly can to come back. So I'm not too surprised he hasn't come out and said it yet. It would kind of cut himself from some leverage he'd have from monetary reasons. But if he does come back, he's going to be in the discussion because he's playing unbelievable basketball. He's really good on both ends. And I don't know if he should win Big Ten Player of the Year for defense, but I would be shocked and really disappointed if Oregon doesn't have two of the guys that make the top five for all defensive team. Bamba at the wing, Biddle at the post. It might be a case of Oregon's having 8 losses in league play, but Biddle's playing well enough to be in that discussion, to be on that team. You should be deserving to be on that team. And it's why I think if Oregon gets to the tournament and can get a favorable seed, they're going to be a tough out because they've got a wing defender that's incredibly good on defense, and they've got a post defender that's incredibly good on defense. And those matchups are hard to beat in a tournament setting.
I think for me, it comes down to shot making with this team. And Jackson has saved them a couple of times this year. I mean, twice in the last, 5 games, the Wisconsin game, memorably, this Indiana game with that big 3. And I know at times he's kind of, played into some of the issues they've had separating or why they were behind. He misses some shots, makes some mistakes here and there. But, his ability to hit those big shots has been so crucial to their run here. And these are not high percentage shots, but he's able to hit them. And, you'd like to see other players step up. And I think that was what was so big recently in the USC game was how well Keyshawn Bartholomew shot it. Like that was to have both of those guys kind of getting it going at the same time from a shot making perspective. Because at this point, I don't know if you agree, Matt, like I just have written off TJ Bamba being somebody you can rely on to shoot the 3.
Yeah.
I just don't buy it. Biddle and Kwame can, and Angel, they can, but it's just the percentages aren't. You're just not going to rely on high volume there. And if you do get 2 or 3 out of those guys, that's probably you'll sign up for that and go, that was about as well as it could have gone. So it really does come down to Shellstad and Bartholomew in my mind from just a consistency hitting the deep shot. And they need those guys to be hot in March. I think it's that simple. And to Jackson's credit, he's played probably his best stretch of ball in his Oregon career here during this win streak. I know it's funny looking through the game log because it's like either he scores 18 to 25 points or he scores like no points. It's just like, he just didn't get it going, but he's been on the right side of that more times than not recently. And again, he is such a big part of this. So, but I want to, let's focus it here on, I don't want to overlook the Washington game, but I think the fans are probably more curious on your thoughts of, I think the Big Ten tournament could go a lot of different ways with seeding. I think the NCAA tournament could go a lot of different ways with seeding. Where's kind of your head at right now? Ducks are 11-8 in Big Ten. I was trying to figure out, like, there are a couple of teams that are 11-6. Like, I was trying to figure out, like, what's the path to, like, how far up could they rise? Kind of give us a sense here. And there's only one more conference game left on Sunday against Washington up in Seattle. But, like, where's your sense of kind of where they're going to be Big Ten?
Yeah, so UCLA has the tiebreaker over Oregon because they won both games this season. So if the Bruins lose to USC to close out the regular season, and both Oregon and UCLA finish tied 12-8. Oregon loses that tiebreaker. Oregon is currently tied with Illinois 11-8. They lose that tiebreaker because they had that game the day after the Rose Bowl when they got thwopped by 30, which is pretty brutal to take, especially now that Illinois is they're trending down right now. They've lost a lot of games lately. Wisconsin, if they lose twice and they have 2 games left, if they lose both of them, Oregon has the tiebreaker over them. And if Maryland loses twice the rest of this week, Oregon has the tiebreaker over them. So they could move up to probably 5 or 6 in the Big Ten standings. Is that likely? Probably not. I think the most likely scenario is Oregon's 7th in the Big Ten. Illinois does have to go to second place Michigan. They do play, at home, 7th place Michigan. That's going to be a really hard game for Illinois to win that one. Michigan State. So we'll see what happens there. I think that's probably the most likely scenario. Illinois loses, Oregon beats Washington. They secure the 7th. They play the Wolverines more than likely. in the Big Ten tournament second round if Oregon advances into that region of the bracket. I think they should. From an NCAA standpoint, they're fifth right now in pretty much every mock projection. Every win just continues to increase the possibility that they're in Seattle. The top 4 seeds, 1 through 4, they get preferential treatment of as close to home as possible, no matter what. And then after that, it's just kind of by luck almost. So Oregon's really close to getting like guaranteed being in Seattle. I think it's doable if they beat Washington. They win 1 game in the Big Ten tournament, and you do those 2 things, and now it turns into like a high likely chance you're going to be a 4 seed. If you win 2 in Indy, that pretty much locks yourself in to being a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament, because that would be a win over a Michigan or a win over potentially a Purdue, 2 teams that are squarely in the NCAA tournament, really highly projected from a seed perspective inside the top 4. You're going to get 2 quad 1 games more than likely in the Big Ten tournament. If you win those 2 games, that will enhance your resume from a net perspective. So the ball's in Oregon's court here. Do your job, beat Washington, win your opening game, and there's a high likelihood you're going to be playing in Seattle for the first round of the NCAA tournament, which from an Oregon perspective, when they lost 5 games in a row, they were viewed sometimes as a 9 seed being shipped out all the way to the East Coast. And now you've won 6 in a row. You have an opportunity to win 7 in a row to close out the regular season and make sure that you stay out west, which is a huge advantage for them.
Yeah, I was just going to say, think back to where they were pre-win streak of like, I don't think there was ever a real doubt that they'd get into the tournament because they had like at that point, I think 8 or 9 quad 1 wins, but it was like, they're going to barely get in and this is kind of a bummer. But the fact that you're looking at it now, Matt, and going, okay, 4 seed is very attainable, playing, about as close to home as you could hope for in the tournament setting based upon where all the regions are. Like that would be a dream scenario for a team that, again, has had to really kind of win a bunch of games in a row to get back in the spot. And I wonder, Matt, like, again, this conference tournament's really competitive. It's not in Vegas. They're going all the way across the country now. If they get really hot and let's say they play for a conference championship, like I wonder if they could even get up further into that kind of 3 seed line. I mean, it seems impossible to get any further than that, but you just have to remember the resume here is so strong that like, and if it gets even stronger, I'm still looking at it here and it looks like one of their quad 1 wins is no longer a quad 1. So they only have 8. 8 is still like the 6th most of any team in the country, so like they still have one of the stronger resumes in terms of the victories they have. And it's just a matter of, to your point, Matt, can they take care of business against Washington and then go out in Indy and just kind of swing away? And if they get really hot and make a run, like you could go into the March Madness looking at Oregon being like, is this one of the 4 or 5 hottest teams in the country possibly?
Yeah. So the USC game on the road used to be a quad 1 game that dropped to being a quad 2 because USC continues to lose games. Oregon's moved up to number 30 in the NCAA net. You look at San Diego State, they're flirting. Actually, now I've updated it again. USC has moved back into being a quad 1 game. They're 75th. So if they drop 1 spot, it becomes a quad 2 game. San Diego State used to be a quad 1 game because it was a neutral site. They were ranked inside the top 50. They're now 52. So like that number is going to change probably a lot in the next week or so. It wouldn't surprise me if Oregon all of a sudden has 7 quad 1 wins and 7 quad 2 wins. And it wouldn't surprise me if all of a sudden that number goes back up to 9 for San Diego State getting back into being a quad 1 win. But the bigger point is Oregon's got between quad 1 and quad 2, they're 14-8 in those games. They've played a ton of games against quad 2 and quad 1 opponents. They've got a bunch of wins over both. their resume, and I don't know where this came from, but the predictive analytics term, like the NCAA tournament doesn't use that. They don't seed based off what the data points is going to tell them what could happen. They always base off what has happened. And Oregon's resume, when you look at their numbers, and as long as they stay healthy, you knock on wood for that, their resume says they're a 4 seed. They're maybe a 5 seed. They've got the wins. They just can't trip. You do your responsibilities the last game of the season. You win a game in Indy, and your resume is strong. And it's going to be you're going to be seated well. You're going to be probably on the West Coast, at least for the first round. And for Oregon, that's what you wanted. That's what you hoped for. And it felt maybe unattainable a couple weeks ago when they had lost 5 straight. But here they are. It's March. Oregon's surging up, as they always do under Dana Altman. They've won 20 games again for the 15th year in a row. Dana Altman continues to produce winning seasons in league play. They've secured that with a win over Indiana. He's only had 1 year where they didn't have a winning season in league play. It was his first year, or 500 or better, I should say. So they've secured a winning season in league play. They've got a win over an Alabama team that's really good, a win over a Maryland team that's really good, a win over a Wisconsin team on the road that's really good, a win over Texas A&M that knocked off number 1 Auburn last night. They're also in the top 25. Oregon's, they've got some bad losses, yes, but this team is surging at the right time. They're playing their best basketball at the right time, and it feels like guys have kind of embraced what their role is, what their responsibility is, and it's led to a resurgence of Oregon basketball. We'll see how far it takes them, and it could be a fun March. We'll see.
I just want one more thing was being there yesterday in the crowd. It was a good environment for, you mentioned it feeling like a tournament setting game. And I know at times this year, the crowd hasn't quite been to that level. I thought yesterday was a great environment. And another example of the fact that the Big Ten teams travel, because there was a lot more red out there than I was used to seeing for especially a team across the country in the Midwest. Indiana traveled pretty well, but I just thought that was a really fun atmosphere for, as you said, Matt, a game that was really important for both teams and ended up playing out that way.
Yeah, the USC game was phenomenal from a crowd perspective. Last night, from an Indiana perspective, it was awesome. The Purdue game was a great crowd. And now the responsibility of Oregon's staff, the marketing department, the athletic department, is to kind of bottle this. You've done it a couple times this season. You're going to have some key pieces back next year. Do it again and make it more of a common thing, because I had people tweeting at me last night like, Matt Knight Arena can be raucous. It can be a fun environment. It can be a difficult place to play. And it's when people show up and when people are engaged. Obviously, it helps when the team plays well, and that's kind of the number one factor. But like all the people that are against Matt Knight Arena and say it's not MAC, like it can be MAC, but you just have to show up. And last night, the fan base showed up, just under 10,000 people. It felt like a lot more than that, and it was as loud as it's ever been outside of the USC game in a couple of years. So that's a good thing. We'll cover Oregon basketball, men and women, on duckterritory.com. We'll continue to do these podcasts as well, covering both sides. The women start tomorrow in the Big Ten tournament. The men finish up their regular season Sunday at Washington. We'll talk about it all next week on the podcast as well. You've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.